What if the person you trust most hides not love, but a monster behind their mask of care? What if a mother serving dinner to her children was actually feeding them the flesh of those you once knew? In Depression-era Oklahoma, such a story was real, and for nearly a century, it remained buried in silence. Oklahoma, early 1930s. Dust storms swept across the farmlands. The earth cracked open. Crops withered. Cattle dropped dead in the fields. Families who once dreamed of prosperity wandered along dirt roads, dragging their belongings, searching for hope. The Great Depression turned the American South into a silent graveyard of broken lives. And it was here, amid hunger and despair, that one of the most disturbing cases in American history was born. It was discovered by accident. A young historian digging through county records stumbled upon a faded folder marked Confidential. Holloway Case, 1934. Inside were yellowed photographs, interrogation transcripts, and coroner's reports. The papers smelled of mildew and something darker, as if they had absorbed the terror of the events they described. And the deeper he read, the clearer it became. This wasn't folklore, not some rural ghost story. It was fact. For decades, the Holloway family's story remained buried in whispers. In the small town of Hidden Creek, no one dared say the woman's name aloud. To some, she was just a poor widow, a farmer's wife broken by hardship. To others, she was something else entirely, a predator in plain sight. Her name was Martha Holloway. Outwardly, she seemed ordinary. A tired farm wife in a faded dress, calloused hands, a calm but worn expression. No one would have suspected what she was hiding. Yet Martha transformed her home into a slaughterhouse and her kitchen into an altar, feeding her children with the flesh of those who trusted her most. Neighbors remembered that the Holloway children, Samuel, Emily, and little David, looked healthier than others in the county. While most kids wasted away, theirs had color in their cheeks, meat on their bones. The Holloway home always carried the smell of stew simmering on the stove. When asked how she managed to feed her family, Martha would smile faintly and claim she traded old belongings for food with traveling merchants. No one pressed her for answers. People wanted to believe survival was possible without sacrifice. But the truth was far worse than any rumor whispered across the prairie. The case file reveals that between 1931 and 1934, 11 people vanished after entering the Holloway home. Each disappearance had a convenient explanation. A man heading west for work, a drifter lost in the storms, a relative moving to another town. In the chaos of the Depression, such stories were easy to accept. But behind the locked door of that farmhouse, the truth was unspeakable. The bodies never left. They were carved, salted, and served at the family table. Even today, the testimonies and photographs make the blood run cold. This was no legend. The Holloway case remains one of the darkest chapters in America's forgotten history. The Holloways were once considered one of the most respected and prosperous families in Cellar County. Their farm stood on the edge of the small town of Hidden Creek, surrounded by endless fields of corn and wheat. John Holloway, the head of the household, was a hard-working man who rose before dawn, plowed his land, repaired machines, and tended livestock. His wife, Martha, worked beside him both in the fields and at home. Their children, 14-year-old Samuel, 12-year-old Emily, and 8-year-old David, grew up under their parents' care. Though in the harsh life of the prairie, childhood was never easy. Living with them was John's mother, Eleanor, a frail but sharp-eyed woman whose stern voice carried authority in the house. Before the crash, the Holloways lived better than most. Their barns were filled with grain, horses stood in the stables, and in the shed gleamed a tractor, new, shiny, bought on credit. John was proud of his land. He told his children that hard work was the only shield against hunger. But then the Great Depression came, and with it the Dust Bowl. The fertile soil turned to dust, swallowed by storms that rolled in from the west, stripping the land bare. What had been hope became desolation. The bank loan John had taken for his tractor and seed became a noose around the family's neck. At first, he missed payments. Then the collectors came. Piece by piece, their life was stripped away. First the livestock, then the fields, then the tractor that had once been John's pride. When the debt grew impossible, the bank took almost everything. All that remained was the farmhouse itself and a small garden plot, barely enough to plant potatoes and beans. John refused to give in. He rode into town, argued with officials, begged for extensions. Sometimes he came home late at night, drunk and furious, railing against the system, against fate. Neighbors whispered that he had grown dangerous. Too much anger, too little hope. In March of 1931, when the county sheriff arrived with his men to seize the last of the Holloway possessions, John resisted. According to the surviving report, he raised a hatchet to block their way. The struggle broke out. One deputy fired his gun. Officially, it was written down as an accident during arrest. But to the family, it was murder. John's body was returned to the farmhouse, unusual for those times. He was buried beneath the old oak behind the house, where he had once sat in the evenings to rest. At the funeral, Martha stood motionless, her face carved from stone. No one saw her weep. Later, people remembered that her eyes seemed changed that day, darker, colder, as if something essential had been buried with her husband. From that moment, the Holloway home was left without its provider. Martha carried the weight alone: 3 children, an aging mother-in-law, and a farm that was already failing. To the neighbors, she looked unbreakable. "That woman stands like a rock," they said, but few realized that something else was already stirring inside her. A darkness that would soon consume them all. The hunger in Oklahoma only deepened as the months dragged on. The Dust Bowl storms tore across the plains like living beasts, stripping soil from the ground, burying houses in waves of dust. People wandered the roads with hollow eyes, children collapsed in fields, and families whispered desperate prayers at night that the next day might bring rain. But in Hidden Creek, one household stood apart. The Holloway children, Samuel, Emily, and little David, looked healthier than the rest. While neighbors' children had sunken cheeks, swollen bellies, and eyes dulled by starvation, the Holloway kids still had color in their faces. Their steps were steady, their bodies lean but not wasted. To the neighbors, it was baffling. Sometimes, when the women gathered at the well, they would murmur, "Have you seen Martha's children? How are they not wasting away like ours?" Another would shake her head. "Maybe she hides food somewhere. Maybe John left something behind before he died." But no one dared accuse her aloud. In those times, jealousy could spark violence faster than hunger itself. At the small schoolhouse on the edge of town, their teacher, Miss Carter, noticed it too. She kept a journal, later found in the archives, where she described the Holloway children's strange behavior. Samuel, once lively and bright, now sits silent through lessons. He stares at the desk, as if trapped in some private nightmare. Emily never plays with the other girls anymore. She sits with her brother, whispering when she thinks no one is listening. David draws odd shapes in the dust, circles and lines over and over again. Miss Carter tried to coax them into games, into laughter, but it was no use. They were too quiet, too watchful. At times she felt their eyes linger on her longer than any child's should, not with innocence, but with something heavier, something that made her uneasy. The breaking point came one afternoon when Emily stayed behind after class. Miss Carter asked her gently, "Emily, what do you eat at home? You look stronger than the other children. Your mother must be taking good care of you." Emily hesitated. Her lips trembled as though she were about to reveal something forbidden. Finally, she whispered, "We have a secret." Then her eyes widened with fear and she added quickly, "But Mama says if I tell, she'll be angry. Very angry." The teacher pressed no further. In those days, people respected silence. But the words haunted her. What secret could a child of 12 be carrying that filled her with such dread? At the same time, the Holloway house continued to carry the scent of stew and roasted meat. Neighbors noticed, though they said nothing. One woman, Mrs. Atkins, would later testify, "Sometimes when Martha brought us soup, it was thick, rich, filled with meat. We hadn't seen meat in months. I asked her where she got it, and she just smiled and said she traded an old quilt for it. I wanted to believe her. God help me, I wanted to believe her." The storm of suspicion gathered slowly, like thunder on the horizon. People noticed the children's strange health, their silence, the whispers of a secret. But in a land already broken by hunger and loss, no one dared dig too deep. To question survival was to risk tearing away the thin veil of hope they still clung to. And so the Holloway's secret remained hidden, for now. It was the spring of 1932 when the first disappearance occurred. John Holloway's younger brother, William, was a farmer who lived just a few miles down the road. He was a familiar figure in Hidden Creek, a wiry man with a kind smile, often lending a hand when neighbors needed help mending fences or hauling grain. After John's death, William had made a habit of checking in on Martha and the children, bringing what little he could spare. A sack of beans, a jar of lard, sometimes just his company. Then, one day, William was gone. Martha told anyone who asked that her brother-in-law had packed up and left for Texas. "There's work in the oil fields down there," she said matter-of-factly. "He thought he'd have better luck than staying here and starving with the rest of us." No one doubted her. People were vanishing everywhere. Some fled west toward California. Others rode the rails north, chasing rumors of jobs that never existed. Many never wrote back. It was the way of the Depression. A man could disappear into the dust and be forgotten within weeks. But a few neighbors found the timing odd. Just days after William's supposed departure, the Holloway house once again filled with the smell of cooking meat. The rich, unmistakable aroma drifted across the fields, carried on the dry wind. While other families boiled leather shoes or dug through dead livestock, Martha's children sat down to steaming bowls of stew. Mrs. Atkins, the neighbor who had once praised Martha's generosity, remembered it vividly. "I came by to borrow a bit of salt, and I swear, I smelled roast pork on her stove. My mouth watered, but my stomach turned at the same time. I asked her how she'd managed to get it. She only smiled and said, 'William traded me some before he left.' At the time, I didn't think much of it. Men left, women bartered, life went on. But later, when I remembered, I wished I'd pressed her harder." The Holloway children seemed healthier still. Samuel carried himself with a new kind of gravity, like a boy forced into adulthood too soon. Emily kept close to her mother's side, her gaze guarded. Little David giggled when neighbors mentioned William's name, then quickly fell silent when Martha fixed him with a sharp look. Whispers began to spread, thin and uncertain. "Strange that William didn't even say goodbye," one farmer muttered at the feed store. "Strange that Martha always has meat when the rest of us don't," another added quietly. Yet no one confronted her. The times were too cruel, the need for denial too strong. Better to believe William was swinging a pick in Texas than to imagine darker possibilities. And so Hidden Creek carried on. Families buried their dead, prayed for rain, and ignored the uneasy truth lingering at the Holloway farm. The stew simmered, the children ate, and Martha kept her secrets locked away behind her calm, impenetrable smile. It was only the beginning. The summer of 1932 brought with it not relief, but more mouths to feed. One sweltering afternoon, a figure appeared on the Holloway porch, a distant cousin named Thomas, who had traveled down from Kansas. Dust clung to his clothes, and his face was gaunt, but his eyes carried a restless fire. He claimed he had nowhere else to go. Kansas had starved him out, the storms had buried his town, and rumors said there was still work to be found in the coal shafts near Sayre. Martha, stiff and guarded, allowed him to stay in the small lean-to behind the farmhouse. Neighbors would later recall that Thomas was not an easy man to live with. He was broad-shouldered, rough in speech, and quick to reach for the bottle when his wages came. When sober, he worked hard enough at the mines, hauling coal until his hands blistered. But when drink soured his temper, the Holloway house echoed with shouting. Several times, neighbors swore they heard arguments carried on the hot night air. Martha's sharp voice cutting like glass, Thomas roaring back in anger. Samuel was often seen standing outside during these quarrels, staring at the ground, fists clenched tight, as if guarding the house from within. Emily, more withdrawn than ever, avoided questions about the new lodger. Only little David sometimes slipped, chattering to other children about how Mama and Cousin Thomas fight all the time. Yet, despite the tension, life seemed almost ordinary. Thomas sometimes brought scraps of meat from town, claiming he traded for them with miners who slaughtered hogs on the side. The Holloway stew pot bubbled richer during those weeks, and again the neighbors whispered but chose not to look too closely. Hunger made liars of everyone, and no one wanted to question a full bowl. Then, as suddenly as he had arrived, Thomas was gone. Martha told the story simply. He packed up and left for California, said he wanted to follow the orchards west. Men like him don't stay long in one place. The explanation fit the times. Thousands of desperate men were riding the rails to California, chasing dreams of fruit-picking jobs and a better life. No one asked why Thomas had left without saying goodbye, without leaving a note, without even collecting the few belongings he had brought. If anything, the townsfolk seemed relieved. Thomas had never been well-liked. "Mean drunk," muttered Mr. Atkins at the feed store. "Better he's gone than stirring up trouble here." Others agreed. One less quarrel, one less burden on Martha. They sighed, convinced it was for the best. But some details refused to rest quietly. The night after Thomas's supposed departure, a neighbor swore she caught the scent of roasting meat drifting from the Holloway kitchen, stronger than anything she had smelled in months. She told herself it must have been rabbit or maybe a wild turkey. She never asked Martha. For the second time, the Holloway farm had swallowed someone whole, and life in Hidden Creek went on. By the winter of 1933, the Holloway home had already drawn whispers. First William had vanished, then Thomas, and each time Martha gave a neat explanation. Texas, California, anywhere but here. People believed because it was easier than facing what might really be happening. Then, in February, another knock came to her door. Helen was Martha's cousin, though few in Hidden Creek had ever met her before. She arrived bundled in a ragged coat with her husband, Robert, and their 12-year-old daughter, Sarah. They had fled from the parched lands of eastern Oklahoma, where the Dust Bowl storms had buried their crops and hunger had clawed its way into every household. Their wagon carried little more than bedding and a few chipped pots. Martha received them with a strange calm, almost as though she had been expecting them. "Stay here," she told Helen, "just for a while until you find your footing." She offered them the cramped back room, barely large enough for three, and insisted they sit down to supper. That night, Bowls of stew were placed on the table, thick, meaty, steaming. Robert raised an eyebrow. "Where on God's earth did you get this?" Martha smiled faintly. "I make do. Sometimes a passing trader, sometimes a rabbit from the woods. Providence provides if you know how to ask." Helen said nothing, though she marveled. Her own family had been gnawing on dried roots and bitter weeds. The richness of the Holloway table was a miracle, or something else she dared not name. Days turned into weeks. Against all odds, Helen's family grew stronger. Robert regained color in his face. Sarah's cheeks filled out, and even Helen's weary body found new energy. The neighbors, too, noticed. "That Holloway woman must be touched by luck," one remarked. "How else could she feed so many?" But Sarah, curious and bright-eyed, began to sense the strangeness in the Holloway household. She grew close to Emily, who was her age. The two girls spent hours together in the yard, but Emily was different from other children. She spoke little, laughed less, and sometimes, in the middle of a game, would fall silent, staring at the house as if listening for something. One afternoon, Sarah asked her, "How does your mama keep food on the table when everyone else is starving?" Emily hesitated. Her lips parted, but no words came. Finally, she whispered, "Mama says we're special. We have something no one else has. But I can't tell. If I do, she'll be angry." Then she smiled strangely, as though the answer itself were a secret too heavy for her small frame. Tension thickened inside the Holloway home. Robert grew restless, pacing the floors at night, muttering that something about Martha didn't sit right. Helen tried to quiet him, reminding him of their good fortune. But even she couldn't deny the uneasy silence that filled the house when dusk fell. And always there was the food. Stew, roasts, broth. More than any family in Hidden Creek had seen in years. The smell drifted through the cracks of the house, rich and heavy, a blessing to the starving and a curse to anyone who wondered too much. For Sarah, the Holloway home became both a refuge and a nightmare. She wanted to believe she was safe with her cousin's family. Yet at night, when the house grew quiet, she sometimes thought she heard sounds from below. Muffled thuds, the scrape of wood, as if someone were moving in the cellar long after everyone else had gone to bed. And in Emily's wide, solemn eyes, Sarah began to see a truth she could not name. The night was heavy with dust. Wind rattled the shutters, and the Holloway house groaned against the storm. Sarah lay awake on her cot, staring at the ceiling beams when she heard it. Faint at first, then clearer. A low, muffled moan rising from beneath the floorboards. She froze, holding her breath. The sound came again, raw and broken, like someone calling for help through clenched teeth. Terrified, she shook her mother awake. "Mama," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Someone's down there." Helen frowned, at first ready to scold her for dreaming, but the noise came again, unmistakable this time. Robert stirred, his face tightening with suspicion. He pulled on his boots. "Stay with the girl," he muttered. "We'll see what's in that cellar." Sarah watched as her parents took the lantern and disappeared down the narrow stairs. She waited for the creak of the door, for their voices to return, but the house fell silent. Minutes stretched into hours. The lantern's glow never returned. By dawn, Sarah's eyes were raw from sleepless tears. She stumbled into the kitchen where Martha stood at the stove, calm as always. "They left early this morning," Martha said, her voice smooth and steady. "There was business in town. They'll be back in a few days." Sarah shook her head. "No," she whispered. "They wouldn't leave me." Martha only smiled, setting a plate on the table. The smell filled the room, thick, savory, rich. A roast browned and steaming which she called pork. Samuel and Emily sat down eagerly, eating in silence. David licked the grease from his fingers, grinning. Sarah's stomach turned. She pushed the plate away. The meat's odor clung too heavily, too strangely. She told Martha she wasn't hungry, but deep inside, she knew the truth. Her parents hadn't gone anywhere. They were still in the house. Sarah could not sleep. For 2 nights she lay rigid on her cot, staring at the cracks in the ceiling, listening to the silence that pressed against the house. The cellar door seemed to breathe in the darkness, a presence she could not escape. Every time Martha set food on the table, stews, roasts, meat pies, Sarah's stomach twisted. She forced herself to chew bread only, drinking water until she gagged. The others ate with hollow hunger, their eyes lowered, their mouths silent. On the 3rd morning, when Martha and the children went to the fields and the house was quiet, Sarah's fear gave way to resolve. She crept barefoot across the kitchen, her hand trembling on the latch of the cellar door. For a moment she hesitated, heart pounding so hard she thought it would betray her. Then, slowly, she pulled it open. The air that rushed out was damp, sour, and heavy with iron. Clutching a stub of candle, she descended the narrow stairs. Shadows flickered along the stone walls. The deeper she went, the stronger the stench became. Rot, salt, something metallic that coated her tongue. At the bottom she saw it. On a long wooden table lay the remains of her parents, their bodies hacked into pieces as though they were livestock. The candlelight caught on pale limbs, bound with twine, stacked like butcher's cuts. In the corner, wooden barrels were filled with brine and salted flesh, packed tight as winter stores. A strip of cloth from her mother's dress floated in one of them, stained and swollen. Sarah dropped the candle. The flame sputtered against the dirt floor, and she stumbled back, retching until bile burned her throat. The horror struck her not only in sight, but in realization. She had smelled this before, tasted its echo in the meals Martha had served. She bolted from the cellar, out of the house, her legs carrying her across the fields without thought. Dust scratched her eyes, but she kept running until she reached the neighbor's farm, the Kellers. She pounded on their door, screaming words that barely made sense. She killed them. They're in the cellar. She killed them all. At first, Mrs. Keller thought the girl was raving, half mad with grief. But the terror in Sarah's eyes was undeniable. Her husband, grim and doubtful, took a lantern and called 2 other men from nearby farms. Together they marched to the Holloway house. What they found confirmed Sarah's cries. The men came stumbling from the cellar, pale and gagging, one of them vomiting in the yard. Mrs. Keller, waiting outside, wept when she saw their faces. "It's true," her husband choked. "God help us all, it's true." By evening, the story spread like fire across Hidden Creek. Farmers dropped their tools in the fields, mothers clutched their children tighter, and whispers turned to open panic. Neighbors locked their doors. Some swore they'd seen the devil himself move into the Holloway place. The quiet suspicion that had lingered for months erupted into fear. 11 people had vanished, and now the reason was carved in blood beneath Martha Holloway's home. The town would never be the same. The news spread faster than the dust storms. By the next morning, the sheriff's men rode out to the Holloway farm, lanterns still burning in the gray dawn. Martha was standing in the yard when they arrived, her hands folded calmly in front of her apron, as if she had been waiting. Samuel, Emily, and David huddled behind her, their faces pale but expressionless. Sheriff Albright read the charges in a shaking voice. Suspicion of multiple murders, concealment of bodies, and cannibalism. At that word, the neighbors who had gathered gasped aloud. Martha didn't flinch. She only nodded once, like a woman who had been expecting the noose for some time. They bound her wrists and led her away. Samuel tried to follow, but the deputies pulled him back. "The children go to the county orphanage," the sheriff ordered. "For their own safety." Emily began to cry then, not for her mother, but for the sudden knowledge that she and her brothers were now truly alone. David clung to Samuel's shirt until a deputy tore him free. In town, the interrogations began. At first, Martha spoke little, answering questions with shrugs and silences. But when pressed, she opened her mouth and let the horror spill out as though she were reciting recipes. "It started with John," she said flatly. "They brought him home dead. I couldn't let his body go to waste while my children cried from hunger. He was the first. Then Eleanor, my husband's mother. She was old. She would have died soon enough. Better that she feed the little ones." The sheriff swallowed hard, but she went on, her voice steady. "After that, it became easier. A brother-in-law, a cousin, strangers who came through town. People were always leaving, weren't they? I just gave them a reason not to come back." The deputies exchanged glances, pale and sweating. One crossed himself. But perhaps more chilling than Martha's words were those of her eldest son. Samuel, brought in separately, admitted what no one wanted to hear. "Ma said we had to help," he murmured, staring at the table. "She couldn't do it alone. I held the lantern. Sometimes I helped her cut. I didn't want to, but we had to eat. We had to." His hands trembled, but his voice carried no tears, only resignation. When the transcripts were read aloud in the courthouse, Hidden Creek fell into collective shock. People remembered the hearty stews Martha had shared during the worst of the drought, the jars of broth she had sent to neighbors to keep them alive. And now they realized many had eaten what they could never forget. Mrs. Keller collapsed when she understood. "Dear Lord," she wept, "we fed our children with it. We fed them." She couldn't finish the sentence. Some refused to believe. Others tried to vomit, clawing at their throats as if they could rip the horror out of their bodies. A few fled town entirely, never to return. The Holloway house was sealed, its cellar nailed shut. But no one could seal the knowledge that had already poisoned the community. Hidden Creek was no longer just a starving town in Oklahoma. It was a place branded with a crime so foul it seemed the soil itself had turned against them. And at the center of it all sat Martha Holloway, calm as a preacher at Sunday service, insisting over and over, "I did it for them, for my children, and if I had to, I would do it again." The trial of Martha Holloway was not a spectacle. The county made sure of that. In a time when newspapers thrived on lurid tales, the court in Sayre sealed its doors, holding proceedings in near silence. No reporters were allowed inside. No photographs were permitted. The officials feared what the world might say if the truth escaped into headlines. That in the heart of Oklahoma, during the hunger of the Dust Bowl, a mother had fed her children with human flesh. The jury deliberated only a few hours. The evidence was undeniable. The barrels in the cellar, the neighbors' testimonies, and, most damning of all, Martha's own words, delivered without remorse. She was sentenced to death by electric chair. The judge's voice trembled as he pronounced the verdict. Yet Martha remained still, her gaze unblinking. "I did what I had to," she said one final time. "Any mother would, if it meant saving her children." Her execution was carried out within weeks. The official record noted only that she met her end without resistance. Witnesses claimed her face was calm until the final moment, as though she had accepted her role, not as a criminal, but as a martyr in her own twisted belief. The children's fates splintered. Samuel, the eldest, was deemed complicit, though still a minor. He was sent to a reformatory for 4 years. When he was released, He disappeared into the vastness of America. Some said he changed his name and wandered west. Others claimed he worked in lumber camps in Oregon, a ghost of a boy who had once held a lantern in his mother's cellar. Emily and David were separated and placed in different orphanages. No record remains of where they went or what became of them. They vanished into history, their childhood erased. Sarah, the 12-year-old who had seen the truth, became the trial's key witness. She testified with a trembling voice, describing the cellar, the bodies, the smell that would haunt her forever. Her words sealed Martha's fate. Afterward, she too was placed in an orphanage, but her name lived on in whispers. To the people of Hidden Creek, Sarah was the girl who revealed the darkness, the one who broke the silence that had swallowed their town. The Holloway house did not stand long after the trial. Neighbors gathered one night, torches in hand, and burned it to the ground. Officially, it was recorded as an accident, but everyone knew better. The cellar was filled with stones and earth, buried deep so that nothing living would ever come from it again. Yet the land itself bore the scar. Farmers swore nothing would grow there. Children whispered that on windless nights, they could hear moans rising from the earth, echoes of the voices Martha had silenced. And so, the Holloway case became less a matter of history than of legend, the kind told in low voices by firelight, the kind that carries both warning and curse. The moral was never simple. Some saw Martha as a monster who had crossed the ultimate line. Others whispered, with dread and unease, that hunger itself was the true culprit, that when the stomach is empty and the children's cries become unbearable, even the strongest soul might fracture. Hidden Creek was never the same. Many families left, unwilling to remain in a place stained by such horror. Those who stayed carried the memory in silence, their trust in humanity forever broken. The Holloway story endures because it asks a question no one dares answer aloud. What would you do if the choice was between your child's life and your own soul? It is a reminder that hunger and despair can strip away the thin veil of civilization, revealing the beast beneath. That in the darkest corners of desperation, love can become cruelty, and survival can turn a mother into something less than human. The Holloway farm is gone, but its shadow lingers, not in the earth, but in the hearts of those who know the tale. A warning carved into memory. The line between man and monster is thinner than we want to believe.